and I explained this in a lot of detail on the Saturday show. We have 4 different ways that Biden is blackmailing people, and this is addressing 2 of those. These they brought up the CMS blackmail. CMS is the organization that pays Medicare and Medicaid. They're blackmailing the hospitals. They're telling the accountants and the CEOs of the hospitals, going to pay you for any Medicare or Medicaid unless you vaccinate all your staff or fire them. So that blackmail is being heard. And they're also hearing private companies that don't do any business with the federal government whatsoever, that have more than 100 employees. And so they have lost those 2 in lower court decisions. Those 2 have been lost. Now, there's 2 executive orders, one of them for federal contractors. One is for the military. And the military lost just, the Pentagon lost just last week, violation of the First Amendment. But those 2 are not being heard. There's an even more important decision that was made in a military, but the judge did not put an injunction on it. But that decision, as I pointed out, affects all 4 of these Biden blackmail tactics. So he's got 2 executive orders, one for the military, another one for federal employees. Then he tried via the bureaucracy to blackmail doctors and lawyers, withholding money from them. You see how that works? See what Trump could have done with these governors? That it wasn't even a program, a money that he was giving to them after he declared an emergency. But anyway, getting back to this, the 100-plus requirement, that suffered a devastating defeat where the judge just ripped them multiple ways. One of the key things saying, well, you really don't believe yourself that it's an emergency. You took a long time to make this announcement. You took an even longer time to come up with the regulations. And then after you came up with the regulations, you extended the starting date another month. So you don't believe it's an emergency. But they also talked about the ludicrous aspect of the fact that you're going to make this about the number of employees and not the nature of the work. And that was also brought up in some of the questioning, right? You could have a dentist's office where you don't have 100 employees. But if you were thinking about an airborne virus, you would think that it would be more likely spread there. So if you believed falsely that the vaccine had anything to do with transmission, then you would require it in the dental office before you would require it on, some large construction firm where most of the people are in large open outdoor areas, for example. So none of that made any sense, and he really ripped them on it. Then it went to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. A 3-judge panel heard it, and 2 of the 3 judges overturned that judge's decision without refuting it, by the way, any of the talking points. And so then the entire Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals heard it. After the 3 judges heard it, they called in all 16 judges, and it was tied 8-8, so that the 3 judges' decision, the 2 of the 3 judges' decisions would stand. See, that's how, when we get rid of the Constitution, and when we have people in the like 2 out of 3 people say, no, I don't care what he said, we're going to go with Biden. And then it gets even worse because, we've got state and local governments that are supposed to stand up, and they're not standing up either. But when we look at what happened with the CDC, the only 2 cases now that they heard arguments on, the 2 areas, were for as I was saying, one of the lawsuits for the military pointed out, and I talked about this a great deal with Alex Meyer of Children's Health Defense, and they were part of a lawsuit challenging the authorization of the Pfizer vaccine, supposed authorization by the FDA. I'm sorry, not authorization, approval. I get those. You got to be careful. They sound like the same thing, but you have an emergency authorization, the EUA, emergency use authorization, And then you have approval. Approval has to go through these different steps. And even though they came in and said, well, we're going to get rid of those steps and we're going to give it an approval, then they played the game of Comirnaty versus the vaccines, the Pfizer vaccines are labeled EUA, emergency use authorization. And so the judge called him on that. And he said, what's the difference? You say that they're chemically identical, but they're distinct. They're the same, but they're different. And you also said that they're legally different. Well, if they're legally different, this is a court of law, which means that you haven't approved the only vaccine that is available for the Pentagon and for anybody else in America. We don't have Comirnaty here. Furthermore, if you're saying that Comirnaty, which is not here, that if it was here and we could use it, that could be used, you're saying that, if that is approved, now you can't use the Pfizer emergency use authorization because you can only use EUAs if there is no approved drug. And then finally, you cannot require people to take an experimental drug. And if it's for emergency use authorization, it is experimental. It is not approved. That decision, if he would have put out an injunction, that could and should have had implications to shut down all of these four. But people are not talking about that because this is all about controlling the narrative, not just the government and the court systems. It's about controlling the narrative. So the CDC director had to walk back what Sotomayor said. Remember, Sotomayor said, well, we got 100,000 children in serious condition on ventilators in hospitals. Totally made up. There's only 3,300 kids in hospitals that have tested positive with COVID. And you heard Fauci say, well, a lot of these kids coming in here, they came in for a broken arm and then they tested positive. That's been going on for a long time with everybody. So it got even worse. Listen to what Sotomayor said. Why is a human spewing a virus not like a machine spewing sparks, she said. This is the woman, triple vaxxed, afraid to even show up at the Supreme Court, where everybody else is vaxxed, tested, and masked. Why is a human spewing a virus? So I would say, why is a Supreme Court bureaucrat, and that's all she is, Sotomayor. She's a minority hire. She is a political operative for Obama. She knows nothing, and everybody knows she knows nothing now. Why is she spewing lies? Well, because she's a political machine. That's what she is. So in interviews over the weekend, you had Walensky, the CDC director, had to kind of backpedal. She said, well, first of all, the vast majority of children that are in the hospital are unvaccinated. So what? So what? And for those children who are not eligible for vaccination, we do know they're most likely to get sick if their family members are not vaccinated. So you got to vaccinate them and vaccinate their family members. Everything, vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. The only thing that's allowed is vaccination. Brett Baer, who was interviewing her, came back and goes, but let's talk about what she said. Is that true? 100,000 kids? Because everybody knew that was not true. He says, is that disinformation? To which she answered, well, yes. And in fact, I will say that while pediatric hospitalizations are rising, they're still about 15 times less than our older age demographic. But Sotomayor said this as well. She said, it is within the police power to protect the health and welfare of workers. And you seem to be saying that the states can do it, but you're saying the federal government can't, even though it's facing the same crisis in interstate commerce that states are facing within their own borders. Again, trying to use the Commerce Clause to get around the 9th and the 10th Amendment, even if the Commerce Clause gave all kinds of broad powers to the Supreme Court, even if it allowed them, or not the Supreme Court, but to the federal government, even if it allowed the federal government to continue to expand its reach and metastasize to every aspect of our lives, to stick its tentacles everywhere in our lives, even if that were the case with the Commerce Clause, the 9th and 10th Amendment, done afterwards, would have amended and ended that kind of metastasizing tyranny. That was the reason they put the 9th and 10th Amendment in there. And that was the end cap for the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights comes with a preamble that said, we did this because we don't want the central government grabbing all kinds of power. But of course, Sotomayor isn't going to acknowledge that. Justice Thomas asked a dangerous question. He said, is the vaccine the only way to treat COVID? Again, that is not even relevant to the constitutional issues involved here. There is no science left. What we have is politics. Fauci's not a scientist. He's a politician. And I say he's not a scientist, and I'm adamant about that because he doesn't believe in the scientific method. He preaches from authority. So this is what Jeffrey Tucker says. He says, this was my first time hearing oral arguments in the Supreme Court. He goes, I might have thought holding the fate of human liberty in their hands. I might have thought that they would be getting their information from somewhere other than their own political intuition. Not even their institutions, their intuition. In other words, their biases. Getting it from their political intuition mixed with wildly inaccurate claims from bloggers and media pundits. But I was wrong. And that is deeply alarming to listen to what these, and it goes on for 3 hours and 40 minutes of inane questions and answers from these people. It's deeply alarming, he said, or maybe it is a wake-up call. We have learned today that these people are no smarter than our neighbors, no more qualified to address complicated questions than our friends, and arguably they're less informed than the Twitter sphere about the basic issues of COVID and health. There was not one mention, for 3 hours and 40 minutes, not one mention of natural immunity during the oral arguments, which is truly astounding. From what I could hear, there was a strangely truncated environment in which no one was willing to say certain obvious truths. That's America in the 21st century. There are certain things that must not be said. And we will police ourselves, or police our speech, even if you are a Supreme Court justice with lifetime tenure. You're worried about that. You want to be liked, right? They were afraid to say certain obvious truths, almost as if a preset orthodoxy had been defined at the outset. Almost as if. We're talking about a mandate that profoundly affects the health and the well-being of millions of people. Well, it seems to me like we've had a similar thing like this happen about 50 years ago. We had the Supreme Court venture into waters about which they knew nothing. Tried to pretend that it was science, talked about what other cultures had said, and talked about what they thought was science. The preamble to Roe v. Wade, you have the judge who wrote the decision said, we got to do this. We have some interesting ideas, and there are cultural ideas and scientific ideas about when life begins and what other cultures have always done about abortion, but we must make this decision based on the Constitution. And then they proceeded to completely ignore the Constitution and make it based on what other cultures had done and what some cherry-picked scientific advisors told them. And as a result, as Jeffrey Tucker is saying, we're talking about a mandate that profoundly affects the health and well-being of millions of people. We've had many tens of millions of people murdered because the Supreme Court let them with Roe v. Wade. Yeah, they've gotten it wrong many times. They've gotten it really wrong many times. They supported the Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott decision. Yeah, you got to bring the slaves back. They supported before they opposed it. Within 1 year, they reversed themselves. The relocation of the Cherokee under horrific conditions that was being done by Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson was doing the wrong thing, but he didn't understand how the Constitution worked. And he said, well, they've issued their opinion. First, they said you can do it. Then when they saw what it looked like, they didn't like it, so they changed their opinion. And he says, well, you've issued your opinion. Let's see you enforce it. We don't have anybody with a backbone anymore to stand up to stand for the Constitution. Again, his decision was wrong, but now, what is worse? To have somebody who does wrong, or to have a society where we have erased all of the legal foundation that supports our individual liberty in every regard, everywhere. Has your news been censored, banned over and over again? Has vital information been held prisoner by mainstream and anti-social media? It's the duty of every thinking person to make the great escape to thedavidknightshow.com. There you'll find links to live streams, videos, audio podcasts, and support. Live stream the show at DLive and every Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern. Videos at BitChute and YouTube. New audio podcast, The Real David Knight Show, at Podbean, iTunes, Stitcher, iHeart, Spotify, and more. But even though there's a light at the end of the tunnel, without your support, the show will run out of gas. The links to support the show are at thedavidknightshow.com to donate via Subscribestar, donate via or donate via Cash App, Bitcoin, or P.O. Box. Our sincere thanks to all of you who have stood with us to get this far. Please don't forget to share the links and pray for the country as well as our family.